Welcome to the Lucky Orange Show, where we teach you how to unlock the potential of raw data and shape it into stories that grow your business faster. Let's get into today's conversation.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the Lucky Orange Show. I'm your host, Sean McCarthy, from the team here at Lucky Orange, where we're building the world's greatest conversion optimization toolkit. One of the guys behind the scenes working on everything is joining us today as we dive even deeper into this idea of data storytelling, getting more out of your data. There's data flying everywhere. Now there's AI bots telling you what to do with your data. This year, if you've missed the first few episodes of the Lucky Orange Show this year, we're starting to explore this idea of how can you get more out of your data, find better insights, build better narratives. And of course, an important angle, an important part of this conversation is user experience. And so when people engage with your website, your SaaS tools you're building, your emails, your social media posts, whatever it is, they are engaging with us. There's a user experience there. And so what we want to do today is bring in Nick, who is UX designer for Lucky Orange, and talk through the role of data in UX and some adjacent ideas. So Nick, welcome. We sit a mere several feet away from each other here at Lucky Orange HQ, but it's always nice to throw in some headphones and talk in a more official setting.
Definitely. Yeah. Glad to be back on. I enjoy these conversations.
So I would say that you are data informed, you're data aware, you love reaching out and including data in your process. So maybe we can just start with kind of a more general question, which is to say, what is the role of data in your work? What is the role of data in the day-to-day of a UX designer?
Yeah. I mean, I think you mentioned it a little bit there with the using data to inform your narrative and create a story. Um, Really, I think the new advancements in AI, like you mentioned, data has become such a big focus because I think AI in general is able to surface things that most people required either a team member to do for them or they had to submit a request for, things like that, where it's becoming more and more accessible. And so I think more people have access to data, and seeing it in front of them day to day has made it to where, in order to create a cohesive story for your, whether that's like pushing for a project or you're trying to intro something or set something up, or even just communicate to stakeholders what you plan to do or propose to do. Those people have also become more data aware. So it's more and more important, in order to kind of get that buy-in, to use that as leverage, I guess, is the best way I can think of it, to back up the non-qualitative parts of a project, right? So the biggest thing with that I found with data right now is that it's almost becoming overwhelming. And so now,
Yeah.
less than trying to throw data in there to inform the story, it's now becoming harder and harder, and we've got to be more selective about what that data is, and really be focused in on specific data points that are going to continue to drive that story.
Nobody is lacking data inputs. Nobody is lacking the ability to collect things. I think you talk about it being slightly overwhelming. There's the challenge too of, is our data trustworthy? Is it clean? And that's a whole separate conversation. Maybe we have our analyst on to talk through data
Right.
cleanliness. Data hygiene would be the right word. When I think about UX, I think the word translator comes to mind. Not to rabbit hole, I was at a couples retreat. My wife and I are doing great, but we went to a couples retreat a few weeks ago, and I learned that we took this test called the 5 voices, and they tell you what your voices are. My primary voice is a guardian, and there's a lot to unpack about what that is, what it means. But I was thinking about UX, and it's kind of like if we threw a word to say, what is the kind of person, what is this role within an organization? A UX, I feel like it acts like a translator between all this data, but also organizational need, past opinions and projects that we've done. Do you agree with that label? And in one way or the other, how does this play out within the context of a project? How do you stick true to like the user needs, but then also service these other things that need to be translated into the UX?
Yeah, no, I really like that. It definitely is this hybrid translator role of, you're not only in charge of defining the vocabulary, to stick with
Mm.
the comparison there, but you're defining the vocabulary, but then you're also translating it. And so you not only are like starting with parts and pieces, sometimes you have to define the parts and pieces before you even can get to translating. So that's another layer on top of it. But I think most people think of a translator as already having a starting point with kind of well-defined rules and a shared vocabulary that maybe they're going to be communicating to another group of people. So while that other group of people, that audience is top of mind, the hard part for UX is we don't always get the luxury of having that defined set of rules and shared vocabulary to start with. So that's kind of where it differs, but there is a lot of that translating and decoding that kind of unknown in a way that makes it presentable or makes that unknown accessible to your audience. Another one that just came to mind that I thought of is kind of also like a cartographer is like a really good label or comparison there. Like your audience, the person who's going to be looking at the map or the thing that you're making is top of mind, and you're going to make a lot of choices based on that audience, right? But your starting point, the things you're starting with, still aren't always well defined. And so it's a really interesting job where even at the step one, you're considering the audience, whereas with a translator or a cartographer, to use that as those well-defined points usually don't have the secondary audience in mind when they're established, right? And so I think it makes our jobs really hard, but also really fun and exciting to not only have kind of you've got to make a decision on those starting points, you have to be the one that's willing to say this is what this how this is defined, and you also then have to do it in a way that's communicated effectively. It also doesn't kind of overpass some of the conceptions that your secondary audience may have, right? You may be inferring some things or assuming some things about that audience, and you very quickly realize did not have the right pieces to start with. And so that's always top of mind, even from step one. Whereas with the translator example, I think it makes sense to a lot of people who don't or aren't familiar with the end goal or the end product, because it's more than about that process of translating. You're going from one thing to the other, but there's still this continuous cycle of that, the kind of clarity, come back, rework, and then also test again. And so we've got this kind of circular process in that of continually defining rules and creating a shared vocabulary so that everyone that's not involved specifically with UX can also kind of buy into that process.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an important thing that you did, even just in talking about answering this question. You framed up a narrative that I would better understand. I'm not a UX designer. I'm a marketer. I'm a positioning person. And so saying like, hey, actually, we don't always have a starting point. And so even just adjusting there, a lot of the audience that you're serving throughout the context of a project is internal, is the team that's working cross-functionally to get things out, because UX does sit at the confluence of all these different areas and all these different needs. You interact with maybe more people throughout the company on a regular basis than anybody else, so that it can be translated. So you can take all these inputs from customer support, from the leadership team, from the engineering team around buildability and whatever it turns into. Um,
Yeah, and I mean, those audiences are really also going to kind of define that process, like depending on who you're speaking to is really going to define how how detailed you are or how kind of easy you need to make it or accessible you to make it. If you're speaking with more technical people, obviously you're going to want to include a lot more of that technical details and jargon that they're going to understand, really. Whereas if it's someone who's really just trying to understand at a high level what's going on, this stuff's going to just add fluff and confusion. And so you've got to be really strict about that, considering that secondary audience and what pieces you're going to pull in when.
yeah. When it comes to interacting with data by way of customer feedback, I know that you've built out some process and boards and things to track. Can you share specifically, without giving away too much secret sauce, how you interact with customer inputs, such as support tickets or bug tickets, specifically customer feedback points, reviews, any of these other interactions that come in there? How does that shape when you start to work on a new project or an enhancement or even just research? How do you incorporate customer data and inputs into the UX process?
Yeah, I mean, all feedback's great feedback, right? But it definitely, once it becomes internal, there are different levels of priority when it comes to those things. And so I personally, I really enjoy just starting with the friction. Like, what are we trying to solve here? And immediately go and find, at a high level, if it's specific to a feature, let's go find where the most friction's happening. Is it specific to the feature itself? Is it performance related? Is it general confusion from the users? And those are things that I just like to understand even before I start to talk with other people about the project, right? I just want to understand who the people that are using this, are they experiencing friction in the same way that I'm expecting them to? Because I
Mm,
think we all have understandings of pitfalls of the things we're making, and there's trade-offs always, right? You can kind of funnel yourself into that, oh, I know someone's going to experience frustration here. We're combating that with X, but really, if you start to find when you listen to customers that it's never what you're kind of expecting to be that they're experiencing. And so it really brings to light, for me, a lot of the ways that I can start talking to other people internally about these problems they're having and frame it up in a way that they're also going to stand from, provide some context that would essentially put them in their shoes. And so once I understand those things, I like to also, positive feedback's great. It's good to have a pat on the back every once in a while. But when you're looking for those things, you really need to be focused on, specific to positive feedback, you've got to be focused on what things are you propping up, and are they going to detract from the friction that you're actually trying to solve for, right? You can share a ton of problems that people are experiencing, and then just have two or three highlights of good things, and it's kind of blows everything away of like, oh, but look, these guys are doing great things, and these customers seem to be happy with it. Why would we prioritize that? And so that kind of process first of just understanding friction, moving to understand what things are winning so we don't mess those things up, or
mhm.
at least have a larger impact on those. That kind of allows me to understand where in the workflow the success is happening, because it's more important to understand the friction doesn't always block success, right? Like, just because a lot of people are experiencing friction, it doesn't mean that they're not having successful workflows through your product. Um, it's just a matter of, can we either solve those things and expedite that workflow, or are we able to completely change the workflow by addressing the friction alone, and kind of ignore that just because success is happening does not always mean that friction isn't happening, and vice versa, right? They kind of go hand in hand.
I think we would be painting with rose-colored glass, or looking through rose-colored glasses, if we said there's always enough data to back every decision that we make. There's always enough. Um, there's always a statistical significance, however you would apply that rule to judging customer feedback, finding these friction points. I think the ideal situation is, hey, we've got hundreds of inputs that say this is happening, and we can act swiftly and make an update in the product. When you think about all of the inputs that you have, qualitative, quantitative, and otherwise, how do you get to a point where you feel confident that it's time to say, okay, here's the insight, here's the narrative, I'm ready to take this forward? I realize there's organizational pressures to say sometimes, like, look, there's people that are saying this is broken, go fix it. But in general, maybe particularly with optimization things and building new tools, how do we know when we have enough data to support our narrative?
Yeah, I have found more and more that those things or those connections actually become super obvious. And if they aren't
Mm,
obvious, I think that's step one of recognizing maybe this we need to pivot a little bit and try and search somewhere else, or, frame this up with a new lens. Because those connections between customer feedback and your new ideas or your solutions, they become very obvious very quickly, and naturally they align in a lot of areas. And so trying to find those areas where they align and kind of grabbing onto those quick and running with it. I think we can spend a lot of time sifting through data, trying to find those perfect data points or the specific feedback that really backs up our solution. But in general, there's a lot of things in there you're going to find naturally align already, in the things that you're seeing. And so if you're not finding those patterns or finding those connections between the two, relatively quickly, then that's your sign to pivot, right? And so those things I found come quicker and quicker. And with time of looking at that stuff, it becomes more and more obvious. But those areas are where you start to really dig into, finding the use cases that support your narrative. When they're not, you can wait. You want to weight customer feedback in the decision making process, but there becomes a time where you can only leverage that so much, and you need to focus then in on the patterns that you've recognized or the connections you've recognized between those two things, less about, oh, I need one more data point to support this. Let me sift through this for another hour or two and try and find it. Use what you're finding immediately and what becomes obvious, and those are going to be the most successful, I found.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, especially if you find a pattern that's showing up more in your ICP or your, whatever an important group of customers would be, that makes it easier to latch on. It makes me think about A/B testing theory, where a lot of times, if you have a strong enough understanding of your customer and your website and you see patterns, you may not even need to A/B test something.
Right.
You can just release it. Now in the product world, that's likely different. We're always going to want to, run some sort of feature flag test sort of situation, but we don't always have to follow the exact same process every time. And so I imagine what you're saying is that we don't we don't have to search for hundreds and hundreds of data points. There's no magic number of data points. Once we have enough confidence and you've done something similar before and seen, you can pull from all these other points. And I think that's something worth thinking about if you're a UX designer or if you're a marketer and you're thinking about data storytelling. Part of the data network you have is your past experience.
Yeah.
And so you've got your qualitative customer inputs. You've got visual analytics from heat map session recordings if you're optimizing a site. You've got your GA4 and revenue reporting and all these things. But you also have, what have I done previously and how did it work? How did it play out? How did customers react to this piece of content? Do they like long form? Do they like short form? What do they usually click on our product page? And that's a muscle, and that's the experience that we gain as we do project after project. And so it's not necessarily that the barrier to a good narrative with the amount of data we collect gets lower and lower and lower, but we might be able to have more confidence as we operate with a pattern and say, yeah, this pattern looks similar to these 10 other things that we've worked on in the past 18 months. We can confidently go this way. It follows a bigger level pattern. Maybe there's a pattern that we're seeing for this specific project that mirrors a pattern, say simplicity, or we need to be more obvious about buttons. And, within the user experience, there could be these patterns that cross over between projects.
Yeah. And I mean, even trying to read in between the lines there, I mean, there's going to be things that you are recognizing that are happening, but understand that the end result isn't always because of the perceived connection, right? Like it may be perceived by the user that this is happening because of X, but we need to take our own experience into that and kind of read between the lines and understand that there actually may be other parts of this, even sometimes in completely separate parts of the app, where we've created a false mental model for the user, for example, that they have expectations of one thing happening and they're experiencing another. And that comes down to, like you said, our experience. It's not invalid to use our experience as professionals just as much as customer feedback and weight them the same. We're here for a reason. And I would go as far as to say, if we're having to use hundreds of data points in order to support our narrative, I think we have failed right away only because we needed so many to support the decision. There are always enough within just the handful of data points to use. If those are strong enough, it's going to be read by the larger group. I think it's much easier to get that buy-in or for everyone to align on the goal of something like that when it comes to having really effective data points versus large numbers of data points.
For sure. And of course, a part of this that you sort of alluded to is paying attention to how your customer preferences change. And it's not even just the people that are paying for and using your tool or shopping on your website. It's at large, what is the user experience of using the internet? Search has been blown up. in some ways with AI overviews. And SaaS products continue to evolve in the way that you interact with them, which is what we talk about a lot here. And paying attention to that is a very, very valid and not to be overlooked data point in these conversations. It's like, we're seeing this trend. Our competitors did this. We have to value that, and it gets weighted differently in different projects. Maybe we pay less attention to something if we're pushing an innovative new feature. We don't know how customers are going to react to it, but if it's something part of our core toolkit, maybe we have a better reference point of, okay, well, this is what our competitors have offered for a decade now, and that sort of thing. So I definitely think that there are many more inputs to be considered than just your basic reporting that we think of when it comes
Definitely.
to data. We've talked before about balancing aesthetics and usability. And I'm curious, when I think about aesthetics and usability, not to belittle the profession of UX, but I think like art project, because I don't have a deep enough knowledge of UX fundamentals to be able to say, like, actually, this is a really fine scientific balance of it being usable and being attractive. Can you
Yeah.
dive in? You can take this whatever direction you want, but can you talk about how that plays out, balancing aesthetics, usability, or maybe having them at the same time, and then how data can inform your approach in delivering the good balance of aesthetics and usability?
Yeah, when thinking about data in that role, I mean, it makes me kind of think usually when you're looking at those things, you're going to be in that kind of research phase
Mm,
of the process. And so my approach for like data and research focused on aesthetics specifically is very different from the focus that I have on data and research during like when I'm focused on usability. And so I do like to separate those things where usability is definitely prioritized and first. Usability is prioritized for first, but aesthetics inform that decision because they go so hand in hand. I mean, they while they're kind of two separate factors, they can have a huge impact on one another. And I think it's more effective to separate them in research specifically. I think there's other parts in the process where those do become blended, and it's much more harder to kind of separate the two. But when you're thinking about research and trying to find data that supports something for when you're focused on aesthetics or something for usability, I think you're looking in two very different places. Even though the end result, those two things will have an impact on each other. When you're looking at data or you're trying to research what your competitors are doing specific to aesthetics, that seems to be more of a market fit. You're trying to understand how your product is perceived, whereas usability is really how do we drive the most value out of our product and make this the most seamless experience. And so trying to find data points that support are we doing are our users able to effectively accomplish their goals that they come into our product with. That's going to be very different than are our users not even recognizing who we are? Are we not getting enough, eyes on us simply because we're not fitting into our market? We don't have a good market fit because of these aesthetics, or it could come down to even the choices you have in typeface. Are things readable, right? And if you've chosen this funky, crazy typeface for all of your headers, and for some reason users are struggling to read it, but you're trying to be data informed, those decisions fall outside of usability, but you can see because it's not accessible, there's an impact to usability there, right? So there's a really fine line, and I think it all comes down to what point in the process you are is how I think about those things, and being careful not to start to blend them too quickly. Thinking about them separately really early on in the process and trying to be specific about where the data points that I have or that I'm pulling, what category do those fall into? And are they better supported in the frame of usability, or are they better supported in the frame of aesthetics?
I think when you're delivering a recommendation around that involves an aesthetic change or input, much like many topics in marketing, it's really easy for people to have an opinion. And I think that you do a good job of coming into a room and saying, here's what we're recommending and why. And the why can live, and it can definitely require some data. I'm curious, maybe for newer UX designers, you're still fairly early career, but you've been here for a while. And for people just getting started in UX, what is the best way to come into a room and talk about aesthetics and even usability and make these recommendations with confidence, understanding that people are going to say, I think it needs to look more modern, or I think it needs to be red instead of green. How do you navigate sort of these what ifs, well, I thinks sort of conversations?
I think that goes back to our original point of UX being closely aligned as kind of a translator, right? I
Mm,
think you have to be very specific in the way that you're communicating these things. And when it comes to aesthetics specifically, the best approach is always the simplest approach and the least amount of noise. And so how can you get super focused on the why and less on the thing that we're making, right? We want to really focus in on the supporting points of this is why and this is what's going to the impact it's going to have, these changes are going to have. Whereas I think with usability specifically, it's it's really hard to communicate those things because you've got to be very abstract. You aren't usually looking at actual product images or you're not looking at things in the product. You're looking at sometimes workflows or user flows that are just boxes of text connected to
yeah,
one each
yeah,
other
yeah.
with actions, right? And that level of separation from the product to usability research and trying to present those things, I think can be applied to aesthetics. It's just much harder because aesthetics are obviously much more visual. So when we're trying to like avoid the noise or sift out the noise of those things of, well, I really prefer this or I like this kind of thing, the best way to tackle that is to not show the things. Let's talk about the things. Let's find those supporting reasons and the whys. And more likely than not, your stakeholders are you're there for a reason. They trust you and they trust your decision. And if you're providing a good enough why or enough of a why, the questions of, well, I prefer this usually don't come into play. It those things happen a lot more, I find, when you've got this big fancy slide deck and it's got all of your decisions, and then also, well, here's some options that we can also explore, and you're showing tons of visuals or you're showing lots of colors and changes you've made. People are going to have opinions on visuals. People don't usually have opinions on your decision making process, right? And the
Mm.
process that you brought to the table to say, this is where I landed and how I got there. And that's usually a more effective way to communicate that. And that's been kind of the standard for usability conversations anyways. So when we're talking about how do we make this feature or this workflow more efficient, reduce friction for users, it's so abstract and it makes the conversation much more focused because we're not looking at the big picture as a whole, and there's so many less distractions. And
Yeah.
so as new UX designers, I think the more they can think about that abstract and less about relying on the actual deliverable, the better you're going to be at communicating those things.
It makes me, there's a meme floating around. It's March 13th. I know memes are a flash in the pan, but there's a meme floating around from Severance right now. Adam Scott has a line that says this work is important and mysterious or something like that. And that's what I think of when you talk about that. I actually posted it on LinkedIn the other day talking about positioning. It's mysterious and important. So UX is very much
Yes.
that. I mean, I think you're right. Like it's a undervalued skill in a variety of, if you have a visible position within the company where you are getting in front of people and saying, here's what I think we should do based on all this knowledge, you've asked me to come up with something to do. It's an undervalued skill to be able to train people to know that when they come into a meeting with you, here's what they can expect. And it feels comfortable and that says, hey, I know that when he shows up, there's going to be a narrative of some sort that says, here's what's happening, here's the situation. It takes into account everything that needs to be taken, everything needs to be accounted for. It's data backed, it's going to be presented in this fashion. And that makes people more comfortable with the recommendation in the end. They care less about like, what's about to happen in this meeting. They know what's going to happen, whether the meeting title stays the same or otherwise. It's, I think that that's something to be, there's something to be said for being able to train people and understand this is the way we operate. It involves insights, it involves data, it involves a data story. So any decision we make, we should depend on that. And it can be an outlier when you show up and don't have that, you know?
Right.
So
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, communicating early and effectively, like that's the goal is if you can communicate those things early and get that across to people, like you said, it makes them so much more comfortable and so much more willing to have an open dialogue rather than presenting opinions.
yeah, if somebody is just joining a new company, because I think that we've talked about gaining task specific competency, industry specific competency. But if you're taking the role of UX at a new company and you're being asked to optimize things, I think you talked earlier about something interesting, which is that data both helps you in a way of giving you reactive opportunities, but then you're also looking for these proactive things to say, using a tool like Lucky Orange, what's happening on our product pages. Oh, well, it looks like people are clicking on this as opposed to this. There's that proactive and reactive thing. If somebody is taking on UX for a brand, for a new company, an existing company, I should say, not a brand new company, that's a whole other conversation.
Definitely.
Where
Yeah.
where would you recommend people start to get their heads around the current state of data? Assuming there's data flowing in from everywhere, like most companies, what's a good way to wrap your mind around the current state of things so that when something breaks or when an opportunity comes up, they're ready to take advantage of it?
Yeah, that's a big one, and I know that that's kind of a challenge. I think for most people in UX, with or even in just in tech, I think with
Mm-hmm.
the amount of time jobs or different places these roles happen every 2 years, kind of is the ideal of what people kind of jump ship and move on, and then you're starting fresh, right? And I
Yeah.
found that really the best source to start with was who's been here, who's existing here, and how have they been using it? What things are they looking at? And not letting that kind of dictate your process or where you move forward. But I think it gives you it levels the field to understand where the focus has been. And then you need to take that internally and say, okay, where am I going to shift the focus and how can I do that effectively? And not being afraid to hold those opinions and say, just because these processes or the things we've been looking at are established, being willing to kind of shake that up and still having a why to back that up, but being willing to say, I'm actually thinking this is where we need to be focused and have that communication really early. Like be willing to have that and don't because it's super easy to get there and like in the first year of just being frozen and kind of just following an order, following the process that's been established, letting things happen and watching from the side. But I think the earlier that you can get in there and have those conversations that maybe make everyone else that's already been there question the processes that they've been following, that's the best place to go because I think it opens up dialogue with others of, well, actually, what could we be doing differently? And how long have we been doing this? When could we have shifted? Those kinds of things. And then from there, you take it, and I immediately then move to understanding the users. Like, who are these people? How are they using it every day? What are they looking at? What are their goals? What are they trying to do here? Before I even get into trying to understand the product, right? Like that we're naturally as UX designers, I think it's really easy for us to understand the product and get a good idea or a base level understanding of what it is, how it functions, and what are the different parts and pieces. But the side of it, of the emotional side, really, of who the people that are working on this and building this, what are they thinking about? How are they thinking about it? And then how does that align with the same with the customers? What are they thinking about and looking at? And if they're not aligned, I think it then becomes obvious of like things that you need to focus on. Whereas if they are aligned, you know that you're in a better spot and you can start to shift your focus to the product itself.
Yeah. I mean, you said it earlier, like you're in the room for a reason. And so people want you to, in a positive, intelligent way, challenge things. I love a good saying or phrase and quote, and the river is easiest to cross at the source, I think is a
Hmm.
good one, where it's like,
Yep.
it applies to so many things, interpersonal relationships, where it's like, if you see something, quite literally say something and say, have we thought about it this way? I'm noticing this in the data. the other part of what you said, I think if you do show up on day one and there's a complete lack or an underwhelming amount of customer feedback collection, one, like the customer feedback is still happening. It might just not be put into a place that's usable and useful. So it does feel like it's really, really easy to turn on GA4 and all these other reporting tools. The customer feedback is maybe the little bit more difficult one to start gathering. And I know that I think you've put into place a couple of things where we can better collect cross-functionally all these pieces and put them into a place that are tagged. I think even the support team tags
Yep.
feedback, right, and categorizes them. But
Yep.
that feels like another place where you might need to start if you have an underwhelming thing, because you're right. At the end of the day, that's super vital, is the psychology that's happening on the other side. I talk a lot about the anxieties and motivations of these people. They have expectations of how your product or your website works, your experience will work. They're worried about buying your product from your brand because they don't know you, or they're motivated to buy it because they want to look good for something coming up, or they want, they want to change, they want to see some sort of change. With Lucky Orange, they want to be better at their job of optimizing their website. They want to learn more about their customers. So understanding your customers is huge, and we can guess all day, but we have to have those feedback points coming in and categorizing them. I don't know if you have anything else to add there.
And also, you have to understand or find out, I guess, if the people you're working with are also willing to go there, right? And start
Mm.
to find those things. If you show up day one and they haven't been collecting those types of customer feedback, or if they, like you said, if they are and they're just not very accessible, is it because they aren't willing to, or is it because no one has, pushed them in that direction yet, or it's not been considered yet? And it's key to understand the difference there of we're not willing to because of this, whether that's resources, time management, whatever that is, a swath of things, or is it simply just a you're you're here now, we have you to help us with this, right? Show us the way, and you've got to be willing to go both ways. If it's because they're not willing to, back to the hard conversations, like having those conversations and questioning those things, and not telling them what to do and telling them why they've been wrong for not doing it, but posing it as questions so that they start to think about themselves, like start to question themselves and their processes so that they can start to see that impact.
I think that brings back the power of the data story and the narrative, is to say, I think it helps communicate and ground everything in reality, that people across all functions can understand. And you know, I think it's easy to get frustrated when we think organizationally, like, why have we never thought about this? Why have we never done this before? Well, that's way less important than just starting to do it. Like, it
Yeah.
doesn't matter. You're going through the jungle and you're chopping through, like, why didn't we know that this tree was going to be in our way? Well, we didn't see it yet. And so I think it's completely fine to welcome change and to ask these questions. And that's why you're there. And so I think, just to put a pin in kind of this role of a UX designer showing up at a new company, ask about that sort of thing when you're in an interview. I mean, I know that's not what the
Yeah.
show is about, but if you are
Yeah.
considering a new role, ask them how they deal with data, ask them how they deal with customer feedback points and where it lives and how they communicate cross functionally. And of course, it can go too far, and we can have everyday meetings and stand ups about this stuff and build in a bunch of bureaucracy that doesn't need to be there. But it is important to understand the current state of data if you're going to come in and try and tell better stories with it.
Yeah,
Um,
and I mean, understand the weight of that at your company.
mhm.
It's going to have more of a weight in decision making in some places than it will others. It's going to depend on your product. It's going to depend on your ICP, but understand where that falls in line of the decision making process and how much weight it has during those conversations, and play to those strengths. If it's not something that, or if you're, a lot of the team isn't super data informed and they don't really make their decisions based off that, how can we start to create better narratives so that it doesn't feel like it's data, right? Like, how do we get to a point where they're starting to be comfortable with it because it's been translated or masked in a way that makes it approachable? And it's not going to be a one size fits all type of process or end result either. So yeah, like you said, if even in the interview process, the earlier you can understand those things, I think the more effective you'll be at your job.
Nick, this has been a real treat. I know you're a busy guy. There's a lot of projects that unfortunately you can't talk about right now.
Yes,
There's
yes.
a lot of stuff coming in the next, even 3-6 months. That's super exciting. So if you've made it to this point in the episode, thank you so much for sticking around. I hope you really enjoyed this as much as I have. We will have some product updates to share in the few months. We'll probably have Nick back on to talk through the process and tie this conversation back to some of these real world things. There's other stuff that we probably can talk about, but really exciting times. Thank you so much for carving out some time in your day. I'll let you get back to your communication, data, and all of your good work that you do over there in the corner. But I really appreciate you joining me today.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to be on. Really enjoyed it.
All right. Thanks, Nick. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of The Lucky Orange Show. Before we go, if you haven't tried Lucky Orange yet, head over to www.luckyorange.com for a free 7-day trial of our leading conversion rate optimization toolkit. What's in that toolkit? Well, let's start with session recordings and heat maps. With session recordings, you can watch a full playback of an entire visitor journey on your website. Everywhere they click, scroll, move, everything they do in your site, a full playback. So you can see what's getting in the way of conversions and what is getting people over that finish line to convert. With dynamic heat maps, you can see the average visitor behavior on a page. So you can see clicks, moves, and scrolls. You can see how far down the page the average visitor is scrolling. And if something is below that line, that means that more than 50% of visitors are not seeing that. Lucky Orange also offers tools like live chat, announcements, and surveys so that you can communicate with your website visitors in real time. So again, if you have not tried Lucky Orange, or if you're not a user yet, head over to luckyorange.com, check it out, 7-day free trial with no credit card required. If you're a Shopify store owner, head over to the Shopify App Store to download the Lucky Orange app to your store today, as well as BigCommerce, HubSpot, Square, and many more. Check us out, and happy optimizing.